Hi there. I'm very pleased today to be with Jane Fraley-Burgett, who is the director of the Disability Services for Students Office at Western Michigan University, as well as Jessica Schwartz, who is our Associate General Counsel, again at Western Michigan University. And we're going to be talking to you today about resources for instructors, whether full-time faculty or part-time instructors for students that have disabilities. So thank you so much, Jane and Jessica, for being here. And can you start us off by talking about how you would refer students without a registered disability, but for whom you think they might have a disability, to DSS?
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer, for letting us present today. And that's a great first question. And for students, so hopefully all faculty have a syllabus statement that states that if a student needs accommodations or feel like they have some academic barriers, that they would meet with Disability Services for Students. And hopefully those students would come and talk to them about that. But if there are some students that are struggling in your class, and you think, well, maybe they could use some support with Disability Services for Students or other supports on campus, I think the first thing to do is maybe have that conversation. And I think it's okay to ask, have you received accommodations in the past, or do you think academic accommodations might be helpful? And even saying, like, if you don't identify having any kind of academic disability, or don't have ADHD or a learning disability like dyslexia or dyscalculia or cognitive processing, it's okay for them to still refer them to our office and have that conversation with the student. And sometimes that can be a hard conversation because then we would figure that out with the student. We would have an interactive process with them, talk with them about maybe if they've struggled in the past, what academic barriers have they had, and how we're going to help them bring them down. And maybe it's not our office, but it could be the Writing Center, it could be the Bronco Study Zone, it could be math tutoring, or maybe an outside reference that we could refer them to. And we can also refer students, we have scholarships for students to be able to get testing through the Counseling Center in Sangren. And so they do some testing for cognitive processing, learning disabilities, so the Woodcock-Johnson or the WASC, and we can help support that with students on campus.
Great. Thanks so much, Jane. Can you talk about some of the types of disabilities that students may present with and examples of accommodations that they might qualify for?
Sure. So it is a very large spectrum. So when students hear that word disability, a lot of times they might not identify with that word. They may identify with having a medical condition or having mental health issues, and not really think about them themselves as having a disability or be in that community. So we have like maybe about 7 different categories, 6, I think there is. So the largest population that we serve are students with ADHD, and then students that are blind or low vision, students with mental health, students that have autism spectrum disorder, deaf and hard of hearing, and then learning disabilities, and then medical conditions. So medical conditions could be anything from Crohn's disease to students that are going through chemotherapy. So if it's something that is going to limit their education, and it could be even temporary. So it could be something temporary. So we could have a student that's having a major surgery and they need accommodations for 2 weeks because of that major surgery, or a student that got in a car accident. And we can work with those students and look at the documentation so the faculty do not have to do that. And I think the only one I didn't mention is mobility. So mobility disability, so someone that maybe is using a wheelchair, that has cerebral palsy, or that may have some type of where they need to use a mobility aid. So accommodations, for students that have ADHD, a lot of times more time on test, copies of lecture materials, those are like typical ones for those students. for students that are blind, we do have a large blind population here at WMU. And for those students, they're going to need accessible materials. So they're going to need any kind of PowerPoints or anything that you are presenting to your class in a digital format. They're going to need it accessible. And we do have resources for that. WMUX does have an accessibility specialist, and that individual can help. And then for online classes, they do have somebody that works directly with that. So that's Gwen Bostic and then Kara Joggins from WMUX, and they're fantastic. They do a great job. And we go through this interactive process with the students. They have to give us documentation. They have to sit down and talk with us about accommodations they have had in the past, or if this is new to them, how this is going to work for them. And these are accommodations that are approved through our office that stand up to the ADA, right? So as long as the accommodation doesn't fundamentally alter the nature of the class, these accommodations are accommodations that an instructor needs to give to the student. It's not something that they're choosing, the faculty is choosing to do. It's something that, as long as it's approved and it doesn't fundamentally alter, or it's not undue burden to the university, then it needs to be given to the student.
Mm-hmm. And so can you talk, Jane, about how instructors would receive notification of the accommodations that they're required to provide to students in the classroom, and also how they can work with DSS and the student to meet those accommodations?
Yes. So when students come in and do the interactive process and they're approved, faculty members will get an accommodation letter via email. So the accommodation letter will have the student's information, the accommodation, the definition of the accommodation, and then it also talks about the student meeting with the faculty member to talk about the particulars of that accommodation, because maybe an accommodation may fundamentally alter, and DSS is unsure about that, but the student needs to have that conversation. So a lot of times faculty will say, well, I got this letter, but I don't know what student this is. And so I'll encourage faculty to say, well, maybe you can email them to ask if they can set up a meeting with you. And because you got their accommodation letter, I think that's a good way to start the conversation, because sometimes students are nervous about that, process, and not, and they haven't had to do that in the past when they were in high school. So K through 12, it's a much different setup than it is in college. So I think it's fine for the faculty to reach out, but it is the student's responsibility, and we do tell the student that. But as we all know, we all tell students a lot of things, and sometimes that doesn't happen. So it's great if we can support our students in that way. So
great. And can you talk about, so it's nice to know that there's this affirmative obligation to meet the accommodations within the classroom setting, and also an opportunity to consult with DSS as well as with the student if there's ever any questions about how to meet those accommodations, or whether they might fundamentally change the class experience. Could you talk to me now about the some of how the requirements for accommodations might be different within field education, or internships, or other outside of the traditional classroom experiences that students have?
yeah, absolutely. So, absolutely, faculty can come to our office. We're always here. We're here to support students and faculty. We want to make sure that there's good communication and that we're here to support the faculty, because sometimes an accommodation may not be reasonable, and especially in field work. So we encourage faculty to come in and meet with our office. We will navigate the accommodation for the faculty and even talk about the process if it's fundamentally altering the learning outcomes, because we don't want that to happen. We want the student to get the same education as every other student that doesn't have accommodations through our office. So I think it's really important, if a faculty member is confused in any way, not to hesitate to contact our office directly.
Mm-hmm.
Field work, I think I'm really glad you asked this question, because I think there's sometimes confusion with students too. So we tell students, if they're in a curriculum that they're going to have to do field work, that's going to be much different than classroom accommodations.
Mm-hmm.
So the accommodation letter that's being sent out to the faculty, that's for classroom accommodations. A field work accommodations is going to have another meeting with DSS, usually with the student and the placement person within social work, so that we can talk about those guidelines. Because it's really important that I know that social work wants to keep their relationships with their placements and their outside sources. And then also we have to make sure that we are not violating ADA law or confidentiality laws. And we don't want to disclose to placements about the student's disability. That's really going to be the student's choice to do that. And so we're going to work with the placement. DSS is going to work with the student. It's going to work with the placement individual, the coordinator, and we're going to figure out what are going to be reasonable accommodations for practical use in the internship or the placement. So hopefully that answers the question.
It
Well,
does.
I would
It really
just
does.
say-
Go ahead.
I would just say, so this is an area, especially in the medical community, and I include social, I guess, health provider community that's developing under the law, as we're getting more folks with the disabilities who want to have healthcare provider careers. And in fact, like in social work, there's so many social work students are inspired because of things that they have experienced. But that also contributes to their own, mental health, disability or whatever. So just, so everybody knows, we're very aware of all of that and very cognizant of it. And Jane and I are in very frequent contact, so if there's anything that she can't absolutely say yes or no, she calls me. And so we work through that. So just so we don't want people to assume, oh, well, they're not going to be able to do it. Like you don't know unless you ask.
Sure. And that kind of gets us. So thanks so much, Jessica. Can you talk specifically in some of the health and human services fields about how to balance that meeting accommodations without crossing the line and really becoming more of the student's provider role? So keeping in that faculty or an instructor role as opposed to a provider role.
Absolutely. And, we see that a lot. It is a big concern with providers, health and human services providers who are moving from the clinical work to the classroom or the administrative work. It's hard to turn that off, but we really need to be careful that when you're approaching the students, you're not approaching them as their clinician who is trying to help solve their underlying problem or diagnose and that sort of thing. You're in a different bucket, wearing a different hat here. Your job as the faculty member or the administrator is to help the students succeed in school. And so a lot of times people are like, well, why does it matter? Well, it matters because we haven't hired you as a licensed clinical social worker to practice as a, you know what I mean? Like we hired you as that, but that's not the point of your practice here. You're not practicing with these students. You're a faculty member. So our insurance, your own personal malpractice insurance, those sort of things. You don't want to be in a situation where a student's coming back and says, well, my clinician said this, but my instructor said this, and I don't know who to listen to. And another time that we see this a lot too is it's one of those no good deed goes unpunished situations where, people at this university really want to help their students. They want to help them succeed in whatever way possible, but by kind of going rogue and trying to solve the problem on your own without going through Jane, or if you're an employee without going through OIE, we get into the situation of Professor A has been doing this for the student for 2 years, but there's no documentation of it. Professor A leaves, Professor B comes in and says, oh, I don't know anything about that. You're going to have to prove to me that you need these things. And now we're in a situation where, again, the student's kind of caught in the middle, and legally that causes the university some problems. So while it may seem like you're jumping through hoops, ultimately it helps both the student and the university to go through the process that Jane has set up.
And so just to clarify a couple of those points, because I think it's helpful for me as a social worker to keep crystal clear on those, that one, we have to be really clear on role delineation. What role are you in? Even if you are a licensed practitioner, that the role that you were in this case is as an instructor or a faculty member. And so that's your relationship with your student in this case, that also that we have to be careful that we don't engage in even past practices which we think are being helpful, which then put the university and more especially the student in a real bind in terms of that role diffusion or role confusion about, you know, like, is this person my faculty member, or are they my clinician, or are they my friend? Because those are three very different roles.
Yeah.
And then thirdly, I think to Jane's point that you mentioned earlier, that the decision about disclosure of a particular disability is the students to make. And then whether there may be some disabilities or the category of disability that is disclosed within the accommodation statement, but that it is not the responsibility of the instructor to disclose to any other third party, including a field instructor or a preceptor in a clinical site, or anybody else that doesn't need to know about the specifics of what that disability is, even if the student has disclosed that information to them directly. So we can't re-release that information to a third party.
You know what, I would also say another reason to really keep your hat separate, and I have to do this a lot of times in my role. I mean, I will very frequently start conversations with, I am not saying this to you as your lawyer. I am saying this to you as someone who just had a conversation with the president, or as a policy person, or whatever. Is when you're a clinician, you have HIPAA to cover you. You have privacy or privilege rules that will cover you. As a faculty member, you don't have those things. So instead, FERPA kicks in, and FERPA kicks in, it's not the same kind of restrictions. And so you could be, you know, required to testify or to disclose what it is the student told you. So that's another reason that you really want to be very clear. And if you getting close to that line where you're kind of thinking, you know, really think the student needs to be in treatment, as the faculty member, you can absolutely say, I really think you need to be in treatment, but you can't do the treatment while you're in your faculty role.
Sure. And then that kind of like leads us, so as we're wrapping up today, could one or both of you talk about how can instructors seek consultation from DSS or from the Office of the General Counsel if they have questions or confusion or need to seek advice or recommendations?
You know, I think the first place is to come to our office. You can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think if faculty should first come to our office and have that conversation. So come to DSS. They can, you know, I mean, email me directly. They can call our office and set up an appointment with me to kind of talk about those things. And then if I feel that, okay, this is something I can't answer, I will either get the Office of General Counsel or the Office of Institutional Equity involved, and then, you know, give the faculty that information. Because I think we should be the office that we start with.
Great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I would agree with that too. I mean, for no other, in addition to everything that Jane said, there's only 2 of us and hundreds of faculty. So we really try to keep our communications coming from either Jane or the dean or department chair or something like that, rather than have individual faculty members reaching out.
Great, thanks. So, so kind of the headline there is that disability services for students are consistently available for instructors to receive consultation, receive education, and to answer questions. And that, Jane, if your office needs to take something to the General Counsel's office, you're certainly happy to consult with them to get clarity on any of the legal parameters.
Yes.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for both of you for being willing to provide some education. And I know that we also will have a handout which has some frequently asked questions that we'll share with our instructors. And thanks so much for your expertise and for, in my experience, really always being willing to do that consultation so that we can be lifelong learners and kind of like grow and evolve in our professional teaching practice together.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, so I just